From Kitty Genovese's murder in 1964, to the Boston Strangler who terrified every woman, to the kidnapping of the Greenlease boys, these were crimes that made you clutch the newspaper tighter, changed the way your parents locked the front door, and defined how you grew up in the 1960s. The Clock Tower Murder. You probably remember the name Charles Whitman, the University of Texas Tower sniper, August 1st, 1966. You might not have known the name right away, but you remember the image. A man high up in that clock tower, rifle in hand, turning an ordinary day into one of the first televised nightmares in American history. It started like any summer morning. Heat rising off the pavement, students milling around campus, some heading to class, others to lunch. Then shots cracked through the air. At first, people thought it was construction noise. You might have thought so too if you were there, until bodies began to fall. Whitman had murdered his wife and mother before climbing that tower with a cache of rifles, scopes, and ammunition. He fired for over an hour, killing 16 people and wounding dozens. You didn't have 24-hour cable news back then, but word spread fast. Radios lit up. TV anchors' voices trembled as they read breaking bulletins. Suddenly, the tower wasn't just a building anymore. It became a symbol of something new, the lone gunman. America hadn't seen a crime like that before. Not live, not in daylight, and maybe, just maybe, it was the first time you realized that danger didn't always come from strangers in alleys. Sometimes it came from the quiet, clean-cut boy next door. Even today, when you walk past a university campus, you can still feel a flicker of that unease. Back then, you didn't have metal detectors or armed campus police, you just had trust. And that day, it shattered. The Manson Murders. Do you remember where you were when the Manson murders hit the headlines? August 1969. It was the summer of love's final breath, and the news felt like a cold slap across the nation's face. Sharon Tate, a name that became etched into the collective memory of America's lost innocence. She was beautiful, glamorous, the kind of woman who seemed untouchable, living up in the Hollywood Hills. But on that night, the dream died. The Manson family, a group of disillusioned followers led by a failed musician with the eyes of a preacher, broke into her home and slaughtered her and her friends in a ritualistic frenzy. You remember the way it felt to hear about it, like something sacred had been violated. It wasn't just murder, it was madness. Senseless and theatrical. You might remember your parents whispering about it late at night, wondering how the peace and love crowd of the 60s could produce something so evil. Charles Manson wasn't just a criminal, he was a mirror, reflecting what happens when rebellion twists into delusion. You started to question everything. The long hair, the communes, the music. For the first time, counterculture didn't just mean freedom, it could mean danger. You locked your doors at night. Maybe you even looked twice at that hitchhiker on the highway, the one with the wide grin and the guitar case. The kidnapping of the Greenlease boy. And yet, before that darkness took hold, there was another case, one that still chills you when you think about it. The kidnapping of the Greenlease boy. 6 years old, September 1953, but the reverberations carried well into the early 60s. You remember hearing about kidnappings like his, stories that never left your parents' voices. The Greenlease case marked a turning point. It taught Americans that even wealth couldn't protect you. When Carl Hall and Bonnie Heddy abducted little Bobby Greenlease, they demanded a ransom of $600,000, one of the largest in U.S. history at the time. But the boy had already been murdered before the money was even handed over. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the cold, methodical deceit, the kind that made every mother hold her child closer, every father eye every stranger suspiciously. By the 1960s, that fear had rooted deep in American families. It was no longer safe to leave your kids wandering far from home. Even the image of a clean-cut couple could hide something monstrous behind closed doors. Kitty Genovese murder. And then, there was the case that changed the way cities themselves were built, the Kitty Genovese murder in 1964. You might not have known her personally, but you remember the headlines. 38 witnesses. That's what the newspapers screamed. 38 people heard her cries for help, and none of them called the police. Now, years later, we know the story wasn't quite that simple, but at the time, it felt like a moral earthquake. It made you question the neighbors you'd lived beside for years. Would they help if it were you out there? Would anyone? The phrase bystander effect didn't exist yet, but the guilt did. For weeks, Americans couldn't stop talking about it. Coffee shops buzzed. Pastors mentioned it in sermons. Parents told their kids to always do something if someone's in trouble. Kitty's death wasn't just a tragedy, it became a social mirror, showing us what fear and indifference could do. And in a way, that story was as much about us as it was about her. And through it all, the news, the crime, the chaos, you could still hear the sound of the evening radio, the hum of the washing machine, the laughter of children outside. That's what made it all so haunting, wasn't it? Life went on, but it was never quite the same. When you think back to those moments, Whitman, Manson, Kitty, you're not just remembering names or headlines. You're remembering the way the world felt, the sense that something fundamental had changed, that trust had to be earned now, not assumed. Do you ever wonder what that decade would have looked like if those crimes hadn't happened? If America had kept its innocence a little longer? Or do you think those dark moments were necessary, the price of growing up, not just for you, but for an entire nation? The Boston Strangler. You can still remember the first time you heard the name, the Boston Strangler. It had that rhythm to it, didn't it? The kind of name that didn't sound real, like something from a pulp detective novel or a late-night radio mystery. But this wasn't fiction, it was fear. Between 1962 and 1964, a shadow crept across Boston's neighborhoods, and people like you, ordinary people, started changing the way they lived. The women who were killed weren't living in dark alleys or forgotten corners. They were in apartment buildings just like yours. Women who worked, who smiled to the mailman, who trusted the sound of a knock on the door. And that's what made it terrifying. There were no broken windows, no forced entries. The killer didn't need to break in. He was let in. Albert DeSalvo. That name didn't mean much at first, not when the newspapers still called him the Phantom Fiend. But every woman in Boston, every mother, every daughter felt that unease in her chest. You could almost hear it in the city, doors being bolted, latches added, the old sense of neighborly openness replaced with suspicion. It wasn't just Boston that changed. You did too. For the first time, Americans were learning a cruel truth. Sometimes evil didn't wear a mask. Sometimes it smiled and asked if it could come inside. If you close your eyes, you might still remember the grainy black and white photographs, the detectives standing in cramped apartments, their hats in their hands, the heavy silence of horror that hung over the city. The news anchors spoke softly when they said, "Strangler." That word felt obscene, as if it should only be whispered. And yet, through the fear, something else began to take shape. The birth of forensic psychology, the beginnings of criminal profiling. You probably didn't know those terms back then, but the shift was happening. America was beginning to study the why, not just the what. The Strangler didn't just kill. He forced us to understand that crime could live inside the ordinary. The Zodiac. Do you remember when the Zodiac appeared? Northern California, late 60s. The letters written in code, the taunting phone calls to the police, the killer who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. If the Boston Strangler was horror behind closed doors, the Zodiac was chaos in the open air. A murderer who wanted to be famous, who turned fear into a game. He wrote to newspapers, demanded they publish his cryptic messages, and signed them with that strange crosshair symbol. You'd see it printed on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle and feel that tightness in your stomach. You didn't even have to live in California to feel it. The Zodiac wasn't just killing people, he was killing peace of mind. Do you remember sitting in front of the television at night, wondering if the police would ever catch him? You might have looked at your own handwriting, comparing it to the scribbles in the paper, as if you could spot the truth yourself. That's how personal it felt. The Zodiac made everyone into detectives, but he also made you realize something darker. That the age of mystery was giving way to the age of terror. That even in the open spaces of America, someone unseen could reach out and touch you. And if you were a parent then, you started watching your children differently. The unsolved nature of those killings, the not knowing, was what ate at you. It was the first time in modern memory that America had a true bogeyman, one who never got caught, one who might have been anyone. Maybe that's why, even now, when someone mentions the word Zodiac, your heart skips. Because deep down, part of you still remembers that feeling. The creeping realization that safety was an illusion. The Appalachian Meeting. But before Zodiac and Manson, before the phrase serial killer even entered your vocabulary, there was another kind of crime reshaping America. The kind that wore suits instead of masks. Organized crime wasn't new, but the 1960s gave it a new face and a new sound. You remember it, don't you? The whispers about the mob, the secret handshakes, the black Cadillacs that glided through city streets like sharks through water. You might have seen the headlines about the Appalachian Meeting in 1957. That secret mob summit in upstate New York, where more than 100 top mafia bosses were arrested in one fell swoop. That single event cracked open the facade. The 1960s was when America finally admitted what everyone already knew, that organized crime wasn't just movie material. It was real, and it was running your cities, from the unions to the nightclubs to the cigarette routes. By the time President Kennedy took office, the Justice Department was at war with the mob. You probably remember Robert F. Kennedy's stern face on TV, vowing to crush organized crime. It was one of the first times America saw crime as an institution, not a random act, but a machine. The hearings, the indictments, the televised interrogations, it all felt like pulling the curtain back on something ancient and untouchable. And yet, the mob had already seeped into culture. You could hear Sinatra singing on the radio, see the glitz of Las Vegas rising from the desert, all while knowing, deep down, that men in silk suits and dark glasses had their hands in it. Crime was becoming glamorous, cinematic even. The word mafia didn't just mean fear anymore, it meant fascination. You couldn't look away. The higher-up assassination. But not every crime of the 60s had a face or a headline. Some were quieter. Some happened in the shadows of justice itself. The civil rights era brought with it crimes that weren't committed by strangers in alleys, but by people wearing badges and authority. You remember the names: Medgar Evers, 4 little girls in Birmingham, Martin Luther King Jr. These weren't just assassinations, they were ruptures in the national soul. When Medgar Evers was shot in his own driveway in 1963, it wasn't just one man's death, it was a wound that every person of conscience could feel. And when those 4 girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, America's innocence cracked again. You might remember exactly where you were when you heard about Dr. King's assassination in 1968, the way the announcer's voice broke, the disbelief in your living room. Some people wept, others rioted, but everyone felt it. The world seemed to stop for a moment, not out of confusion, but out of grief so heavy it felt like gravity itself had changed. That was the cruel duality of the 1960s. One moment you were watching a man walk on the moon, the next you were watching another man fall to violence. Hope and horror danced together. JFK's assassination. And then came the Kennedy assassinations. When President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas in 1963, it wasn't just a national tragedy. Well, no, it was the day television learned how to mourn. You remember that weekend, don't you? The way the country froze, the black and white images of the motorcade, Jackie in her pink suit, the chaos in the streets. You didn't have to be in Texas to feel like you were there. Everyone watched it unfold live, the first collective trauma of the television age. You can still hear Walter Cronkite's voice cracking as he announced Kennedy's death. You can still see Lee Harvey Oswald's stunned expression when Jack Ruby shot him 2 days later, live on TV. The nation didn't just hear about crime anymore. It saw it happen. That was the change. And that moment, that surreal, gut-wrenching broadcast, rewired something inside of you. It made you realize that news could be instantaneous, that horror could enter your living room before you'd even had time to process it. For the first time, America became a nation of witnesses. When Robert Kennedy was killed just 5 years later, it felt like deja vu. Another idealist cut down, another dream dimmed. You couldn't help but feel numb, like hope itself was being hunted. By the late 60s, crime wasn't just part of the world, it was part of your consciousness. It lived in your routines. The way you checked the locks, the way you looked over your shoulder in a parking lot, the way you taught your kids to be careful. Those were lessons written by the decade's tragedies. And yet, looking back, there was a strange resilience to it all. You didn't give up, you didn't hide. Life went on. Families still gathered around the dinner table, radio still hummed, children still played. Maybe that's what made you stronger. You learned to live with awareness, not fear, to pay attention. And when you think about it now, it's almost poetic how those crimes, those headlines, those whispered fears shaped the foundation of the world that came after. They gave birth to new laws, new protections, new understandings of justice. They changed how police departments operated, how journalists reported, how communities came together. The 1960s wasn't just the decade of crime, it was the decade of awakening. You grew up watching America lose its innocence and gain its consciousness. You saw the world learn, sometimes the hardest way possible, that every action echoes. And as strange as it sounds, maybe that's why those years stick with you. Because for all the horror, they made you who you are. Someone who remembers. Someone who lived through the shift from trust to caution, from denial to awareness, from silence to speaking out. Tell me, when you think back to that decade, do you remember the fear first or the strength that came after it? By the time the late 60s faded into the early 70s, you could feel something shifting in the air. The music was still sweet, the cars were still chrome and powerful, but the innocence had drained away. You lived through too many headlines, too many funerals, too many televised shocks to pretend that America was still the same. The country had grown up, and so had you. The Zebra murders. And right there, at the hinge between decades, came a new kind of fear. Not just of killers, but of cults, conspiracies, and crimes that felt almost too strange to be real. Do you remember the Zebra murders? San Francisco again, just a few years after the Zodiac. It felt like the city could never catch a break. Between 1973 and 1974, a string of random attacks shook the Bay Area, leaving 14 people dead and dozens more wounded. The perpetrators called themselves Death Angels. You might not have known all the details back then, only that the murder seemed senseless, that the victims were chosen by chance, and that the city's peace had evaporated. The fear spread like fog. People stopped walking alone at night. Taxi drivers refused to take fares to certain neighborhoods. You could feel that tension, that quiet paranoia, even hundreds of miles away. The idea that violence could strike anyone, anywhere. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was the world you lived in. And that's what defined the end of the 60s, didn't it? The randomness, the unpredictability. Crime had become unpredictable theater, dramatic, terrifying, and public. The D.B. Cooper disappearance. Take D.B. Cooper, for example. You can still picture it. November 24th, 1971. Thanksgiving Eve. A man in a dark suit, black tie, sunglasses, and a calm smile boards Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. He hands a note to the flight attendant. He has a bomb. He wants $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. You remember how it dominated the news? People were glued to their radios. A skyjacker who wasn't violent, who didn't hurt anyone. He just took the money, jumped out of the plane over the forest of Washington, and vanished. No trace, no body, no parachute. And maybe that's what fascinated you most. After all the horror of the 60s, here was a criminal who felt almost mythical. Not evil, but mysterious, like a ghost in a business suit who slipped through the cracks of modern America and disappeared into legend. Even now, when you see an image of that composite sketch, the sunglasses, the slicked back hair, something inside you stirs. D.B. Cooper wasn't just a headline. He was a symbol of how the 1960s had changed crime itself. It wasn't just about violence anymore. It was about spectacle, rebellion, and the power to outsmart authority. But while Cooper's escape fed your imagination, another kind of horror was brewing. Quieter, colder, and far more personal. You remember hearing whispers about Jonestown, maybe not in detail until the late 70s, but the seeds were sown in that very era. The late 60s, when cults started sprouting across America like weeds in the cracks of idealism. You'd seen the communes, the free love gatherings, the promises of peace and spiritual awakening. Jim Jones cult. But then there was Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher who promised equality and salvation. To those who followed him, he wasn't a cult leader. He was the answer. But to those who watched from outside, something felt off. The 1960s had taught you that charisma could be dangerous, and Jones had plenty of it. By the time news of Jonestown broke in 1978, 918 people dead in a mass suicide. The horror was beyond comprehension. You probably sat there, stunned, listening to the reports on television. Mothers, fathers, children, all gone. Their loyalty turned fatal, but the roots of it went back to the decade you'd grown up in, when faith and fear often shared the same language. And yet, even before Jonestown, there was another kind of collective madness, the Manson family. You already heard about their crimes earlier, but what came afterward, the media frenzy, the courtroom spectacle, revealed something new. America wasn't just afraid of crime anymore, it was enthralled by it. You could see it in the coverage, the interviews, the magazine spreads, the public obsession with the faces of killers. For the first time, criminals were treated like anti-celebrities. Manson's grin, his followers' vacant eyes, they became icons of something twisted and magnetic. You started to realize that crime wasn't just shaping behavior, it was shaping culture. Movies, books, even songs started reflecting the darkness that had crept into the national psyche. You'd go to the drive-in and see films like Bonnie and Clyde or In Cold Blood, stories about real people, real blood, real chaos. And the strange part, you couldn't look away. because deep down, you knew those stories weren't just about them. They were about you, about the world you'd watched unravel. But the 1960s also had crimes that didn't make front-page horror, crimes that redefined justice itself. You remember hearing about corruption scandals, about the rise of corporate greed, about the underbelly of power. It wasn't always violence that defined crime. Sometimes it was deceit. Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa. Take the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa. You remember that name. Loud, stubborn, defiant. Hoffa was the face of working America and its quiet corruption. He built the most powerful labor union in the country and allegedly cut deals with the mob to do it. You probably saw him on television. The bulldog jaw, the confidence, the way he stood up to senators like he was untouchable. And then, one day, he was gone. July 30th, 1975, vanished from a restaurant parking lot in Detroit. No body, no witnesses, no trace. Just like that, another mystery entered the American bloodstream. You couldn't help but wonder if he'd been buried under concrete, or if he'd slipped away like Cooper, living under another name. The truth never came, but the legend lived on, proof that even power itself wasn't immune to disappearance. But through all of this, the assassinations, the cults, the mobsters, the mysteries, you still had the small-town crimes that felt closer to home. The ones that made the evening news, the local tragedies that never became famous but still lived in your neighborhood's memory. A missing girl, a store robbery gone wrong. The small tremors that reminded you that even outside the headlines, the world was changing. You started locking your car doors at night. You started leaving a light on when you went to bed. You taught your children to stay close, to never talk to strangers. And for the first time, the words serial killer and mass murder became part of the everyday vocabulary. G-men. The FBI adapted too. You remember hearing about J. Edgar Hoover, the stern face, the immaculate suits, the G-men, building databases, profiling methods, nationwide communications. The technology of crime fighting was evolving just as fast as the crimes themselves. You could feel it, a world turning digital before it even knew what that meant. Still, for every step forward, there was another reminder of how fragile it all was. The more the world advanced, the more you realized that fear doesn't fade, it just changes form. And maybe that's why, when you think back on those years, it's not the criminals you remember most vividly. It's the way they changed you, the way they forced America to grow up, to face the reality that peace and violence could coexist, that progress always came with a price. You remember walking down the street as a kid, waving to your neighbors, riding your bike until dusk without a care. Then one by one, those little freedoms started to vanish. Come inside before dark. Lock the door behind you. Don't open it unless you know who it is. Those weren't just safety tips, they were the quiet rituals of a changing country. But even in that darkness, there was resilience, a kind of American stubbornness. You didn't stop living, you adapted, you learned. You built neighborhoods that looked out for one another again. You raised children to be alert, to be aware, to care. That's the legacy of those crimes, isn't it? They didn't just steal innocence, they taught you how to protect what mattered most. Sometimes you wonder if the world feels more dangerous now, or if you just remember it more vividly. Maybe the truth is that the 60s burned those lessons into your memory so deeply that every siren, every headline, every unsolved mystery still echoes with that same uneasy heartbeat. And yet, for all the fear, there's nostalgia too, because those were the years you grew up. You remember the smell of newsprint on your fingers, the way the radio hummed in the background while the nation held its breath, the grainy photos in Life magazine. You remember the mix of horror and hope, and how, somehow, you made it through both. So when you hear those names, Manson, Zodiac, Whitman, DeSalvo, Cooper, Hoffa, you don't just think of killers or thieves. You think of how those names became bookmarks in your life, the world before them and the world after. And maybe that's the strange magic of it all, that even through chaos, you found your sense of time. The 1960s didn't just define crime, they defined you. Tell me, when you think back on those years, do you remember the headlines or the way your heart raced when you heard them? Do you remember the killers or the people who survived? You know what's strange? For all the years that have passed, you can still feel the 1960s. Not just see them in photographs, but feel them, like a hum beneath your skin. That decade never really left you. It's stitched into your habits, your caution, your awareness, even the way you watch the news today. Because once you've lived through that much chaos, that much revelation, you never look at the world quite the same way again. You grew up in a time when crime wasn't entertainment, it was personal. Every story came through in black and white, straight into your living room. and you had no choice but to face it. You couldn't scroll away or mute it. You watched Walter Cronkite wipe his eyes on live TV. You heard your parents whispering about what this world is coming to, and you learned something deeper than fear. You learned how fragile normal life really is. The crimes of the 1960s didn't just fill the newspapers, they redefined trust. They reshaped how you moved through the world. Before that decade, the door-to-door salesman was welcome, the babysitter was the neighbor's kid, and the phrase stranger danger didn't exist. But after, the locks got heavier, the smiles more cautious, the eyes more observant. You started to look differently at people, not with suspicion, but with awareness. You became more careful about who you believed, who you followed, who you let in, and that awareness didn't fade when the decade ended. It followed you into the 70s, the 80s, and beyond, into a world that was watching itself through the lens the 1960s had built, because that was the decade that invented the true crime era. Before then, crime was something whispered about in courtrooms and alleyways, but by the end of the 60s, it had become part of the national conversation, part of identity. You saw it reflected in newspapers, in radio dramas, in the movies that came after. You could feel the shift from pretending it didn't exist to trying to understand why it did, and maybe that's why those stories still grip you, because they were never just about the criminals, they were about us. About how a society learns to process fear, about how a family learns to carry on after something unthinkable. Think about it. The Kennedy assassination wasn't just about one man's death. It was about the nation learning what grief looked like on television. The Manson murders weren't just about a cult. They were about how idealism curdled into disillusionment. The Boston Strangler wasn't just about a killer. It was about the moment you realized that safety was an illusion, that the most ordinary places could hide darkness. Those moments changed you at the core. Do you remember what it felt like to walk down the street after those headlines? You probably didn't notice it then, but you walked differently. You paid attention to sounds, to shadows, to the feeling of someone walking behind you. It wasn't paranoia, it was evolution, a quiet, instinctive adjustment. You were learning what it meant to live in a world that had shown its cracks. And still, somehow, the 1960s gave you something else. Resilience, the ability to keep moving forward, to build a future out of chaos. You didn't give up on people. You didn't stop believing in good. You just stopped believing that goodness was automatic. That's what made your generation different. You didn't grow up with the luxury of ignorance. You saw too much too soon. And instead of turning away, you adapted. You taught your kids to question authority but to value truth. You taught them to be cautious but compassionate, because deep down, you knew what fear looked like, and you didn't want them to learn it the hard way. And maybe that's why nostalgia feels so heavy now. Because when you remember the 1960s, you're not just remembering the music or the cars or the fashion. You're remembering the weight of being aware for the first time. The sound of the newspaper landing on the porch in the morning. The way the world seemed to hold its breath during breaking news bulletins. The ache in your chest when you saw faces on the screen that you'd never forget. You grew up in a time when every headline felt like history unfolding, not just information. You weren't reading about crime. You were watching the world lose and rebuild itself, one story at a time. And you know what's remarkable? You made it through. Even as the world got darker, you found ways to find light. You went to work, you fell in love, you raised families, you built communities stronger than fear. You learned to talk about what once was whispered, and because of that, because of the way you faced it all, the generation that came after you inherited not just your caution, but your courage. You taught them what awareness looks like. You taught them that locking your door doesn't mean living in fear, it means valuing what's inside. That reading the news doesn't mean surrendering to despair, it means paying attention. That's what the 1960s gave you, awareness. The decade that stripped away the myth of safety but gave you the tools to live smarter, stronger, sharper. And maybe that's why, when you hear the words, breaking news, today, part of you still tenses. You've been trained by history to brace yourself. You've seen how fast everything can change. But you also know something that younger generations don't. That every dark moment has its answer in human resilience. You've seen the world fall apart, and you've seen it rebuild. So when you think back to those years, the sound of the typewriter keys clacking in the newsroom, the flicker of the TV screen, the way neighbors gathered outside to talk about what they'd heard, you're not just remembering crimes, you're remembering a shared heartbeat, a country finding its way through the dark. And it's easy to forget that now, when everything moves faster, when headlines vanish as quickly as they appear. But in the 60s, news stayed with you. You carried it. You felt responsible for it. You remembered the names, the faces, the dates, because the world felt smaller, and every story felt personal. You weren't just a spectator, you were a witness. And maybe that's the gift buried beneath all the horror of that decade. It forced you to grow up, but it also taught you empathy. You learned to pay attention not just to what happened, but to who it happened to care about people you'd never met, to feel connected to strangers through shared shock and grief. Because that's the other thing people forget about those years. For all the crime, for all the loss, people came together. After the assassinations, after the riots, after the killings, Americans didn't drift apart. They held vigils, they shared stories, they marched, they built movements, they changed laws. And it's that spirit, that refusal to be broken, that defines the generation who grew up in the 1960s. So when someone asks what it was like to grow up back then, it's hard to explain, isn't it? You can't summarize it in one sentence. It wasn't just about the Beatles or the moon landing or the cars with tail fins. It was about living through history so raw it sometimes hurt to breathe. It was about waking up to the truth that the world was both beautiful and brutal, and that you had to hold both at once. It was about learning that love and fear could share the same radio dial. So maybe that's the real legacy of the crimes that defined your generation. They weren't just moments of darkness, they were mirrors, showing you what kind of person you'd be when the world demanded courage, and you rose to it. You lived through the Tower Sniper, the Strangler, the Zodiac, the assassinations, the cults, the chaos. You saw the worst, and you kept your faith in humanity anyway. You raised your children to be more careful, yes, but also more compassionate, to think critically, to stay aware. That's the paradox of growing up in the 1960s. You were hardened by fear, but softened by empathy. You were scarred, but wiser. And that balance, that constant tension, is what made your generation unforgettable. So tonight, if you find yourself remembering the headlines, the broadcasts, the long silences after bad news, don't just remember the fear, remember the resilience. Remember that you survived history as it unfolded, one crime, one heartbreak, one moment of courage at a time. Because that's what it meant to grow up then. You didn't just live through the 1960s, you lived because of them. And maybe that's what connects all of us who still remember, that we lived through a time when the world broke its own heart, and we kept going anyway. Tell me, when you think back to that decade, what's the moment that still echoes loudest for you? The one that changed how you saw the world forever? Go ahead and share it down in the comments, or with someone younger who's never known what that kind of awakening feels like. Because the 1960s aren't gone. They live on in every cautious habit, every curious question, every ounce of empathy we carry forward. You remember? And that memory, that shared, sacred memory, is history's heartbeat. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.